Grace Bennett was folding a stranger's laundry at 2 in the morning when she found out her husband had already picked out the marble countertops for the house he never told her about. She didn't know that yet. All she knew, in that moment, standing under the buzzing fluorescent light of the Sunrise laundromat on 5th and Colfax, was that her feet hurt, her back hurt, and in 6 hours she had to be at the diner to open the register before the breakfast rush. If you've ever given everything you had to someone and watched them walk away like it cost them nothing, stay with this one until the end, because Grace's story is going to make you angry before it makes you proud. And if stories like this move you, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe now, because you don't want to miss where this one goes. Grace grew up in a small brick house on the edge of Millbrook, Ohio, the kind of town where everybody knew whose porch light stayed on too late and whose didn't come on at all. Her mother worked 2 jobs cleaning offices downtown, and her father left before Grace was old enough to remember his face clearly, just a blur of a man in a photograph tucked into the back of a drawer that her mother never talked about. Grace learned early that nothing in this life was given. Everything was earned, scraped for, fought for with your bare hands, and even then, sometimes it still slipped away. She met Marcus Reed the summer she turned 22, at a community fundraiser for the local library where she was volunteering to sort donated books. And he was there because his mother, Patricia Reed, had donated a check with her name embroidered across the top of the program, like she owned the whole event. Marcus was tall, careful with his words, the kind of young man who seemed to measure every sentence before he let it out of his mouth, like he was already practicing for a courtroom he hadn't stepped into yet. He told Grace he wanted to be a lawyer, not because his family had money. They didn't. Not really. Not after his father's construction business collapsed under debt when Marcus was 16, but because he wanted to be the kind of man who could stand in a room and make people listen. Grace liked that about him. She liked that he wanted something bigger than Millbrook, because she wanted that too, even if her version of bigger looked different than his. They dated for 2 years before he proposed to her on the pier at Miller's Lake, down on one knee with a ring that Grace later found out he'd put on a payment plan he could barely afford. She said yes before he even finished the sentence. Her mother cried at the wedding, not because she was happy, exactly, but because she was afraid, the way mothers get afraid when they've seen too much and hoped for too little. Marcus is a good man, her mother told her the night before the wedding, sitting on the edge of Grace's childhood bed. But good men can still leave a woman with nothing if she's not careful to keep something for herself. Grace laughed it off then. She didn't understand yet. She would understand later, when it was almost too late. For the first year of their marriage, things were simple in the way that new marriages are simple, full of small apartments and cheap furniture and plans scribbled on napkins about the future. Marcus was working as a paralegal at a mid-sized firm downtown, saving every dollar he could toward law school applications, staying up past midnight studying for the LSAT at their kitchen table while Grace washed dishes behind him and told him she believed in him, over and over, like a prayer she never got tired of saying. And she meant it. That was the thing nobody could take from her later. She meant every word of it. When Marcus got accepted into law school 2 states away, in a mid-sized city called Ashford where the tuition alone would have swallowed both of their salaries whole, they sat at that same kitchen table and did the math 3 separate times, hoping it would come out different the 4th time. It never did. Financial aid covered part of it. Loans covered another part. But there was still a gap, a wide, hungry gap that grew wider every semester, and somebody had to fill it. "I'll get a second job," Grace said, like it was the simplest thing in the world, like she was offering to pick up milk on the way home. "Grace, no. You already work full-time at the accounting office. And now I'll work nights too. It's not forever, Marcus. It's 3 years. We can do 3 years." She started working the overnight shift at Ashford General Hospital as a patient care aide, a job she'd never trained for, but talked her way into anyway, because the hospital was desperate for warm bodies and Grace was desperate for the extra $400 a week. She would leave the accounting office at 5 in the evening, eat a sandwich in her car in the hospital parking lot, and clock in at 7 for a 12-hour shift that had her changing bed linens, helping elderly patients to the bathroom, and mopping up things most people would rather not think about. Then she would drive home as the sun came up, sleep for 4 hours, and do it all again. Marcus, meanwhile, was buried in casebooks and moot court and study groups that ran late into the night. He would come home to their small apartment and find dinner already made, the electric bill already paid, his shirts already ironed and hanging in the closet, and he rarely asked how any of it got done. That was the part that would haunt Grace later. Not that he didn't help, but that he stopped noticing there was anything to help with at all, like the machine of their life ran itself, like Grace was just part of the furniture that kept the lights on. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that settles into a person's bones when they are the only one carrying the weight, and Grace carried it quietly for 3 years. She missed her cousin's wedding because she couldn't get the shift covered. She missed her mother's 60th birthday dinner because she'd worked a double the night before and slept through her alarm. She watched her own dreams. She'd once wanted to open a small bakery, something modest, something hers, fold themselves up small, and get tucked into a drawer, the way her mother's photograph of her father had been tucked away, out of sight, easier not to look at. "You're not going to forget me and all this law stuff, are you?" she asked Marcus one night, half joking, lying beside him in the dark after she'd come home from her shift smelling like hospital antiseptic. "Grace, come on. Everything I'm doing for us." She wanted so badly to believe that us included her the same way it included him. She didn't ask the question again after that. She just kept working. If you're watching this and you've ever poured yourself into someone else's dream until there was nothing left for your own, tell us in the comments. What would you have done in Grace's place? Would you have kept going, or would you have walked away sooner? Let us know, because Grace's answer is about to be tested in a way she never saw coming. In Marcus's second year of law school, he was selected for a prestigious moot court team that traveled to competitions across the country. And it was there, in a hotel conference room in Chicago, that he met Vivian Ashcroft, a third-year student from a wealthier program, who argued cases with a polish Marcus had never seen up close before. Vivian's father was a federal judge. Her mother sat on the board of 2 nonprofits. She wore blazers that fit like they'd been made for her, because they had been, and she spoke about the law like it was a language she'd been born speaking rather than one. She'd had to learn late and hard, the way Marcus had. Marcus didn't think of it as anything at first, or told himself he didn't. He and Vivian ended up on opposing teams in the semifinal round, and after the competition, they got coffee to debrief, the way competitors sometimes do, trading notes on strategy and case law. But something about the ease of Vivian's world settled into Marcus like a splinter he couldn't quite locate, a quiet, persistent itch. Here was a version of the life he was building for himself that didn't come with hospital shifts and instant noodles, and a wife who fell asleep in her scrubs on the couch because she was too tired to make it to the bedroom. Vivian's world looked like the finish line. Grace's world, more and more, started to look like the struggle he wanted to leave behind. He didn't tell Grace about Vivian, not because anything improper had happened between them yet, but because some part of him already knew that even mentioning her name would require an explanation he wasn't ready to give. Instead, he came home from Chicago quieter than usual, and when Grace asked how the competition went, he said, "Fine. Good exposure," and left it at that. Patricia Reed, Marcus's mother, had never fully warmed to Grace, though she was careful to keep her disapproval polite, tucked behind compliments that always carried a small, sharp edge. "Grace works so hard," she would say at family dinners, in a tone that somehow made hard work sound like a character flaw rather than a virtue. "It's admirable, really, all that overtime. Though I do wonder sometimes if a lawyer's wife should be smelling like a hospital hallway." Grace would smile and let it pass, the way she'd learned to let a lot of things pass, because arguing with Patricia never went anywhere good, and Marcus rarely stepped in to correct his mother when she said things like that. He would just look uncomfortable and change the subject, and Grace told herself that discomfort was its own kind of defense, even though, deep down, she knew it wasn't. By the time Marcus entered his third and final year of law school, the financial gap had grown into something Grace could no longer close with overtime alone. The bar exam prep course cost more than either of them had anticipated. The final semester's tuition installment came due at the worst possible time, right when Grace's car broke down and swallowed the small emergency fund she'd been quietly building for 2 years. She sat at their kitchen table one night with a calculator and a stack of bills and did the math 4 times, hoping, again, it would come out different. It didn't. She didn't tell Marcus what she did next, not fully, not for a long time. She went to a pawn shop on the outskirts of Ashford and sold the wedding ring her grandmother had left her, a small diamond in an antique gold setting that had survived 2 world wars and 3 generations of women who had nothing else of value to pass down except that ring and the stubbornness it took to hold on to it. She got $1,100 for it, enough to cover the tuition installment with a little left over for groceries. When Marcus asked, months later, why she wasn't wearing it anymore, she told him the setting had gotten loose and she was having it repaired. He believed her, because it was easier to believe her than to ask a second question, and Grace let him believe it, because the truth would have required him to actually see what she was giving up, and some quiet, wounded part of her had started to suspect he didn't want to see it anymore. She also took out a personal loan in Marcus's name that same semester, without asking him first, using his social security number, which she had memorized years ago for tax purposes, and a signature she practiced late one night at the kitchen table until it looked close enough to pass. It was wrong. She knew it was wrong even as she did it, her hand shaking around the pen. But the alternative was watching. 3 years of sacrifice collapse over a $4,000 gap, and in that moment, desperate and exhausted and running out of options, wrong felt like the only door still open. She told her best friend Denise about it one night, crying into a mug of coffee gone cold. I don't know what else to do, Denise. I've sold everything I can sell. I've worked every shift they'll give me. I just need him to finish. After that, I'll fix it. I'll tell him. I'll pay it back before he even notices. Grace, that's dangerous. That's his name on a loan he doesn't know about. I know it's wrong. But if he doesn't graduate, all of it, the ring, the years, the missed birthdays, all of it was for nothing. I can't let it be for nothing. Denise held her hand across the table and didn't say anything else, because there wasn't anything else to say that would have made it simpler than it was. Marcus graduated in the spring, top 15% of his class, with a job offer already waiting from a respected mid-sized firm in Ashford called Whitmore & Cole. Grace sat in the audience at his graduation in a dress she'd bought secondhand 3 years earlier for a cousin's engagement party, clapping until her palms stung, crying the kind of proud, exhausted tears that come from watching something you built with your own 2 hands finally stand up on its own. Patricia sat 2 rows ahead in a new suit, already telling the family friends around her about her son's bright future, barely glancing back to acknowledge Grace at all. Grace didn't mind. Not that day. That day, she thought the hardest part was finally over. She had no idea it was only the beginning of the hardest part. Marcus passed the bar exam that summer on his first attempt, and Grace threw him a small celebration dinner at their apartment with a cake she'd baked herself, because they still couldn't afford to eat out at anywhere nice. Marcus seemed distant that night, checking his phone more than usual, offering short answers to her questions about how it felt to finally be done. Grace chalked it up to exhaustion. Bar exams did that to people, she told herself. He needed rest. He needed time to come back to himself. What she didn't know was that Vivian Ashcroft had also passed the bar that summer, in a different state, and had recently accepted a position at a firm in the same city where Marcus now worked, a firm with connections to Whitmore & Cole through a shared partner who sat on several boards together. Marcus and Vivian had stayed in touch since Chicago, first through occasional professional emails about case strategy, then through longer conversations that drifted further and further from anything professional. Nothing had happened yet, not in the way people mean when they use that word, but something had been building, quietly, for over a year, the way rust builds on the underside of a car nobody thinks to check. If you're wondering whether Grace ever suspected something was wrong before it all came out, the answer is yes. She felt it. The way you feel a change in weather before the clouds actually roll in. That low pressure settling into your chest for no reason you can name. But she had spent so many years telling herself to keep going, keep working, keep believing, that she didn't know how to stop and ask the question that mattered most. Was any of this still going both ways? Marcus started working long hours at the firm, which Grace understood. She remembered what it was like to build something from nothing, remembered every overnight shift she'd worked to get him there. But the hours stretched later and later, and the excuses grew thinner, and there were nights he came home smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers, though Grace told herself it was probably just something from the office building, an air freshener, a colleague's coat brushing past him in an elevator. She didn't want to be the kind of woman who went looking for reasons to be suspicious. She had given this marriage everything she had. She wasn't ready to believe it might not be enough. The firm hosted a gala that fall to celebrate its expansion into a new downtown office, and Marcus told Grace, almost as an afterthought, 3 days before the event, that spouses weren't really expected to attend, that it was mostly a work function, that she'd probably be bored anyway standing around listening to lawyers talk about billable hours. Grace agreed to stay home, though something in her chest ached at the way he said it, like he was relieved rather than disappointed that she wouldn't be there. She found out from a photograph 2 weeks later, one that Patricia had, without thinking, or perhaps without caring, shown her at a family dinner, scrolling through pictures on her phone from the gala. There was Marcus in a sharp navy suit Grace had never seen before, standing close beside Vivian Ashcroft in a deep red dress, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back in a way that made the air leave Grace's lungs all at once. "Who is that?" Grace asked, keeping her voice as level as she could manage. "Oh, that's Vivian. She's brilliant, that one. Works at Caldwell and Pierce. Comes from a wonderful family. Her father's a federal judge, you know." She and Marcus argued together on the moot court team back in law school. They've stayed close, professionally. It's good for him to have connections like that. Grace said nothing. She smiled, the way she'd learned to smile through things that hurt, and excused herself to the bathroom, where she sat on the edge of the tub with the water running so no one would hear her cry. That night, she asked Marcus directly, "Who is Vivian Ashcroft?" He didn't flinch, not visibly, but there was a half-second pause before he answered that told Grace everything she needed to know, even before the words came out. "She's a colleague. We worked together in law school." "What? Your mother showed me a picture from the gala." "Grace, it's a work event. People stand next to each other in photos. That's what happens at galas. You told me spouses weren't invited." "They weren't, technically. Associates were expected to attend with a +1 from the industry if they had one. It didn't seem worth explaining." It didn't seem worth explaining. Grace turned that sentence over in her mind long after the lights went out that night, long after Marcus had fallen asleep beside her like nothing at all had shifted between them. It didn't seem worth explaining. 3 years of night shifts, a grandmother's ring sold for $1,100, a loan taken out under a false signature because she was too afraid to let his dream die. None of that had seemed worth explaining either, apparently. Not in the version of the story Marcus was starting to tell himself. 6 months passed. Marcus made junior partner track faster than anyone in his class, a fact Patricia mentioned to every relative who would listen. He and Vivian were assigned to the same case, a complicated property dispute involving a family trust, and they spent long hours together preparing briefs, hours that bled from the office into dinners to discuss strategy, dinners that Marcus never once suggested Grace join. Grace kept working, kept the apartment running, kept believing, out of sheer stubborn habit, that the man she had built all of this for was still somewhere underneath the polished suits and the new vocabulary and the increasingly long silences at dinner. She should have known something was deeply wrong the night Marcus came home and told her, almost gently, like he was trying to soften a blow before it landed, that Whitmore and Cole was relocating their junior associates to a new development downtown, closer to the courthouse, and that it might make sense for him to get a small apartment there during the week to cut down his commute. "Just during the week," he said. "It's not a big deal. Lots of associates do it." Grace didn't argue. She had spent so many years not arguing, not pushing, not asking the harder questions, that it had become a kind of muscle memory, a reflex she didn't know how to override, even when every instinct in her body was screaming that something was deeply, irreversibly wrong. What would you have done in Grace's place? Would you have confronted him right then, or would you have waited to see how it played out? Drop your answer in the comments below, because Grace is about to find out exactly what kind of man 3 years of sacrifice had helped create, and it is not the man she thought she married. The apartment downtown was not, as it turned out, a temporary weekday arrangement. It was a fully furnished 2-bedroom in a new luxury building called the Ashford Crest, with marble countertops in the kitchen and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, and Marcus had signed a 12-month lease on it 4 months before he ever mentioned the idea to Grace. Grace found this out by accident, the way people often find out the truths that change their lives, not through some dramatic confrontation, but through a stray piece of mail that arrived at their shared apartment addressed to Marcus from the Ashford Crest management office, a lease renewal notice that used the word continued residency, in a way that made no sense for a man who supposedly only stayed there 3 nights a week. Grace sat with that envelope in her lap for a long time before she opened it. Some part of her already knew what she would find inside. The way you know, walking into a dark room, that something has shifted even before you find the light switch. She confronted him that night, the envelope on the kitchen table between them like a loaded gun neither of them wanted to be the first to pick up. How long have you had this apartment, Marcus? Grace, I can explain. How long? Almost a year. A year. Grace felt something inside her chest go very still, very cold, the way water goes still right before it freezes. You've had an apartment for a year, and you told me it was a temporary thing for your commute. It started as temporary. It made sense to keep it. The commute really was brutal, Grace, and with the hours I'm working. Is Vivian on the lease? The silence that followed lasted only 3 or 4 seconds, but it stretched out long enough for Grace to feel every one of the 1,000 nights she had worked, every ache in her back from lifting patients twice her size, every dollar she had scraped and saved and sold pieces of herself to provide, collapsing on itself all at once, like a building whose foundation had been quietly rotting the whole time nobody was looking. It's not what you think, Marcus finally said, which is, Grace would later reflect, exactly what people say when it is precisely what you think. Get out, Grace said, her voice shaking but clear. Get out of this apartment tonight. Grace, let's talk about this like adults. I have been an adult about everything, Marcus. I have been an adult while you were still a boy studying for exams I was paying for. Get out. He left that night, and for 2 weeks, Grace heard nothing from him except a single text message asking if she wanted him to send someone to collect the rest of his things, or if he should come himself. She replied with the name and number of a moving company and nothing else. She thought, foolishly, that this silence was the worst of it, that the humiliation of the truth was the bottom of the pit she'd been thrown into. She was wrong. The bottom was still coming. 3 weeks later, a process server found Grace at the diner where she still worked part-time on weekends, even after all these years, because old habits and old fears about money don't disappear just because a marriage does. He handed her a manila envelope in front of the morning regulars, in front of her manager, in front of the whole small, familiar world she had built her exhausted, sacrificial life inside of, and asked her to sign for it. Grace's hands shook as she opened it right there at the counter, because some instinct told her that whatever it was, it needed to be faced immediately, not carried home to fester in private. That it was a divorce petition. Marcus was filing for the dissolution of their marriage, citing, among other things, irreconcilable differences, and, buried in paragraph 6, an allegation that Grace had engaged in financial misconduct during the marriage, specifically referencing a personal loan taken out in his name, without his consent during his final year of law school. The loan Grace had taken out 3 years earlier in a moment of desperation. The one she had confessed to Denise in a shaking whisper over cold coffee. The one she had always intended to explain to Marcus herself, on her own terms, when the time felt right. Somehow, impossibly, he had found out. And instead of using it as a conversation, he was using it as a weapon. Worse than the loan allegation was what followed in paragraph 9. Where Marcus's attorney had written that Grace's contributions to his legal education, quote, constituted ordinary marital support consistent with the reasonable expectations of a spousal relationship and do not entitle the respondent to any special equitable consideration in the division of marital assets. In plain language, everything Grace had given, the ring, the loans, the missed birthdays, the 3 years of overnight shifts, had been reduced, in the cold language of a legal filing, to nothing more than what any wife should have done. Anyway, and on top of that, Marcus was seeking primary claim to the apartment they had shared for the past 4 years, the one whose lease, as it happened, was in both their names, but whose rent Grace had disproportionately covered during his final and most expensive year of school. Grace read the petition twice, standing at the diner counter, her manager quietly ushering the curious regulars back to their tables. And when she finished the second read, something in her that had been bending for years, quietly, patiently, exhaustedly bending, finally, completely, snapped straight again. She was not going to disappear from her own life quietly. Not after everything it had cost her to build it. Denise found her a lawyer that same week, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named Renata Okafor who had built a reputation in Ashford for representing spouses in cases exactly like this one. The ones where a partner tries to rewrite years of sacrifice into a footnote. Renata was in her 50s, with silver-streaked braids and a voice that never rose above a calm, level register even when the words in it could cut steel. "Grace," Renata said, reading through the petition with a focus that made Grace feel, for the first time in months, like someone was finally on her side. "I want you to understand something before we go any further. What your husband's attorney is trying to do here is very common, and it is very effective if you let it work. He is trying to make your years of sacrifice sound ordinary, and he is trying to make your one moment of desperation sound criminal. We are not going to let either of those things stand unchallenged." "But the loan," Grace said. "I did do that. I did sign his name." "You did," Renata agreed. "And we are not going to pretend you didn't. We're going to own it, in context, on our terms, before he can weaponize it as a surprise. Desperation is not the same thing as malice, Grace, and a judge who's seen enough cases can tell the difference. Especially when we show them exactly what that desperation was in service of. And the house. The apartment. He signed a new 12-month lease on a luxury apartment 8 months before he ever told you he was unhappy in this marriage. That tells its own story. We're going to need records. Every payment you made toward his education, every bill you covered, every shift you worked. Can you get those?" Grace thought of the small notebook she'd kept for years, an old habit from her mother, who had always told her, "Keep your receipts, baby girl, because people forget what they owe you the second it's convenient to forget." Grace had kept every pay stub from the hospital job, every bank transfer to Marcus's tuition account, every receipt from the pawn shop where she'd sold her grandmother's ring, because some quiet, wounded part of her had always suspected, even back then, that a day might come when she'd need proof of what love had actually cost her. "I can get everything," Grace said. The weeks leading up to the hearing were some of the hardest of Grace's life, harder in some ways than the 3 years of night shifts had been, because exhaustion, at least, had a purpose she could see clearly. This was different. This was having to relive, document by document, every sacrifice she'd made for a man who was now standing in front of a judge trying to convince the world those sacrifices didn't count. Patricia Reed, when she caught wind of the divorce, showed up unannounced at the diner one afternoon, sliding into a booth across from Grace with the particular brand of righteous confidence that only comes from people who have never once had to question whether they were the villain in someone else's story. "I hope you understand," Patricia said, not bothering with a greeting, "that dragging this out in court will only humiliate my son. He has a reputation to protect now. He filed the petition, Patricia. He brought the humiliation to a courtroom, not me. You could settle this quietly. Take a modest sum and move on. It would be easier for everyone. Easier for you, maybe," Grace said, and something in her voice, steadier now than it had been in months, made Patricia sit back slightly in the booth. "I sold my grandmother's ring for your son's tuition, Patricia. I signed a loan I shouldn't have signed because I was terrified of watching 3 years of sacrifice fall apart over a few $1,000s. I worked nights until my hands cracked. And now he wants to call all of that ordinary and take the roof over my head besides. I am done being easy for everyone else's convenience." Patricia left without another word, though Grace noticed, weeks later, that she never showed up to a single day of the actual court proceedings, as though some part of her already suspected which version of the story the evidence would tell. There was one more piece to this story that Grace did not expect, and it came in the form of a man named Elijah Turner, the hospital's overnight facilities supervisor, a quiet, steady man Grace had worked alongside for 3 years without ever really seeing him. The way you don't really see the furniture in a room you pass through every day until, suddenly, for reasons you can't quite explain, you do. Elijah had covered shifts for Grace more times than she could count during the hardest stretches of Marcus's law school years, had fixed the ancient supply closet door that jammed every winter, had once driven 40 minutes out of his way at 3 in the morning to bring her a working car battery when hers died in the hospital parking lot during an ice storm, refusing to take a dime for the gas or his time. During the months of the divorce proceedings, when Grace was running on fumes and fear and a stubborn refusal to fall apart in public, Elijah became, without either of them ever naming it out loud, the quiet, steady presence that kept her upright. He didn't push. He didn't ask for anything. He simply showed up. With coffee on the hardest mornings, with a listening ear on the nights she needed to talk it out, with an unshakable, matter-of-fact belief that Grace was going to come out the other side of this stronger, not smaller. Marcus's attorney, digging for anything that might discredit Grace before the hearing, found out about Elijah's involvement. The coffee, the late-night conversations, a photograph someone had snapped of the two of them laughing together outside the hospital break room, and tried to twist it into an allegation of infidelity, arguing that Grace's, quote, inappropriate closeness with a hospital coworker had contributed to the breakdown of the marriage. It was a low, desperate move, the kind of move that told Grace, more clearly than anything else in the entire proceeding, exactly how far Marcus was willing to go to avoid taking responsibility for his own choices. The hearing itself lasted 2 full days. Renata built her case methodically, laying out 3 years of bank transfers, pay stubs, and receipts, calling witnesses from the hospital who testified to the brutal, unglamorous reality of Grace's overnight shifts, calling Elijah himself to the stand, where he answered every accusatory question from Marcus's attorney with a calm, unshaken honesty that left the courtroom in a kind of respectful silence. I helped her because she was drowning and nobody else was reaching for her, Elijah said simply. I never touched her marriage. I touched her flat tire once, and her car battery twice, and I brought her coffee more times than I can count, because that's what you do for someone who's carrying too much alone. If that's a crime in this courtroom, then I suppose I'm guilty of caring about a good person. When Grace herself took the stand and was questioned about the loan, she didn't flinch or make excuses. I was wrong to sign his name, she told the judge plainly, her voice steady even though her heart was hammering. I want to be clear about that. It was wrong, and I've carried the weight of that wrongness every single day since I did it. I did it because I had already sold my grandmother's ring, already worked every overtime shift the hospital would give me, and I still couldn't close the gap between what his education cost and what we had. I panicked. I made a desperate choice in a desperate moment, and I am not proud of it. But I want this court to understand that I made that choice trying to save something I believed we were building together, not trying to destroy anything that belonged only to him. The judge, a measured, sharp-eyed woman named Judge Adora Bello, took a full week to issue her ruling, a week during which Grace barely slept, cycling between hope and dread with an exhaustion that felt, somehow, even heavier than 3 years of night shifts had ever been. When the ruling finally came, it was not simple, and it was not a clean, cinematic victory, because real life rarely offers those. Judge Bello found that Grace's unauthorized loan constituted a genuine legal wrong and ordered her to repay the full amount to Marcus over an agreed schedule, with the court noting, plainly, that desperation does not erase responsibility, no matter how sympathetic its origins. But in the same ruling, Judge Bello found that Marcus's claim to sole possession of the marital apartment was, in her words, not supported by equity. Given the extensive documented evidence of Grace's financial and domestic contributions throughout his education, and given what the judge described as a troubling pattern of the petitioner reframing years of genuine partnership as unilateral, ordinary obligation only once it became inconvenient to acknowledge them. The court further found no credible evidence to support Marcus's allegations regarding Elijah Turner, dismissing that portion of the petition outright, and Judge Bello added, with a pointed look toward Marcus's table, that the court took a dim view of allegations introduced. Dim view of allegations introduced primarily to discredit a spouse's character rather than to establish any relevant fact. Grace retained the apartment. The court ordered a financial settlement that, while not enormous, finally accounted, on paper, in the language of the law, in a way that could never be casually dismissed again, for the years of sacrifice Marcus's own attorney had tried to call ordinary. Grace walked out of the courthouse that afternoon into a cold, bright October sky, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel like she was carrying anything heavier than herself. Marcus approached her in the parking lot before she reached her car, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slouched in a way Grace had never once seen from him during their entire marriage. Vivian, she would later learn, had ended things with him months earlier, once the full details of the petition and its allegations had made their way through Ashford's small legal community, unwilling, in her own words to a mutual colleague, to build anything with a man who would try to erase a woman's sacrifices in a court filing just to make his own ambition look cleaner. "Grace," Marcus said, "I know I don't have any right to ask this, but is there any chance?" "No, Marcus. You don't even know what I was going to say." "I do. And the answer is no." Grace's voice was calm, steady, free of the tremor it might have carried 6 months earlier. "I forgive you, because carrying the anger any further than I already have would only cost me more than it costs you. But I am not walking back into a life where I have to prove, over and over, that what I give is worth remembering. I already proved it. It's on the record now, in a courtroom, in black and white, whether you ever choose to see it or not." She got in her car and drove away, and Marcus stood alone in that parking lot for a long time. The way people sometimes have to stand alone with exactly what they've built for themselves before they can begin to understand it. Grace kept the apartment, though she eventually sold it a year later and used the proceeds, along with a small business loan she qualified for entirely on her own name, this time, with her own signature, to open a modest bakery on 5th Street, called Grace's Table, 3 blocks from the laundromat where this story quietly began. Denise helped her paint the walls a warm, buttery yellow. Elijah built the shelving along the back wall himself, refusing, once again, to take payment for his time, though Grace found other ways to thank him, slowly, patiently, on terms that belonged entirely to both of them, and to no one else's schedule. The bakery did well, then better than well, then well enough that Grace hired her first employee within the year, a young woman working her own night shifts somewhere else to pay for community college, and Grace made sure, every single week, that her employee's schedule left room for the parts of life that mattered beyond just survival. She never lectured the girl about it. She simply made sure the room existed, the way she wished someone had made sure for her, all those exhausted years ago. Grace and Elijah married 2 years later, in a small ceremony in the backyard of Grace's mother's house, the same brick house on the edge of Millbrook where Grace had grown up learning that nothing in this life is given freely and everything worth having has to be fought for. There was no marble countertop waiting for her this time, no lease signed in secret, no version of her story reduced to a footnote in someone else's ambition. There was just a quiet, steady man who had shown up for her long before he ever asked for anything in return, and a woman who had finally, fully, learned the difference between sacrifice that builds a life together and sacrifice that quietly erases the person giving it. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way through. If Grace's journey moved you, made you angry, or gave you a little bit of hope, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more stories just like this one, drop a comment telling us what part hit you the hardest, and share this with someone who needs to hear that what you give to another person's dream should never be dismissed as ordinary. We'll see you in the next story.